January 21, 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. Before dawn, the plateau was already vibrating under incoming fire. Mortars and artillery were crashing into the marine perimeter as fog clung to the wire and red dirt, and the question hanging over maps in Saigon and Washington was the same one many officials had asked for years. What use is heavy armor in a war like Vietnam? In the policy imagination, this was a conflict of jungle trails, ambushes, and dispersed guerrillas. Tanks looked like the wrong instrument for the wrong battlefield. At Khe Sanh, that assumption began to break under live fire. The battle that followed became one of the most studied clashes of the war. But the key point for this story is not only the scale of bombardment or the symbolism that later attached itself to the base. It is that Khe Sanh was not defended by infantry and artillery alone. Marine Corps historical records show that 5 90mm tanks from the 3D Tank Battalion had been moved to Khe Sanh before Route 9 was cut and were attached to the 26th Marines, alongside 2 Ontus platoons from the 3D Anti-Tank Battalion. Those tracked vehicles were held as a mobile reserve and could be rapidly shifted to threatened sectors. That detail matters because it cuts straight across the old Washington logic that treated tanks in Vietnam as a liability first and a battlefield asset second. At Khe Sanh, armor was not a prestige weapon searching for relevance. It was protected, immediate direct fire inside a perimeter under sustained pressure. In a fight defined by cratered ground, low visibility, and sudden assaults against fixed positions, the M48's value was not speed across open terrain. It was the ability to deliver heavy, repeatable fire exactly where the defense was being tested. This is the first hidden lesson of Khe Sanh. The M48 Patton did not prove itself in Vietnam by replacing infantry doctrine or turning jungle war into conventional maneuver war. It proved Washington wrong by doing something more important. It made a besieged strongpoint harder to crack and gave Marine defenders another layer of survivability when the margin for error was measured in seconds. And once that reality is clear, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why had so many planners underestimated what armored firepower could do in Vietnam in the first place? What made Khe Sanh such a sharp test case was that it exposed a gap between battlefield conditions and institutional assumptions that had hardened long before the siege. In Washington and in parts of the wider policy community, Vietnam was often framed primarily as a guerrilla war fought in jungles, paddies, and dispersed villages, a conflict in which heavy tracked armor seemed too slow, too vulnerable to mines, too logistically expensive, and too tied to European-style warfare. That skepticism was real enough that later U.S. Army armored studies would explicitly note how widely it had been believed that Vietnam's monsoon climate, jungle, and rice paddies were too hostile for mechanized forces. Khe Sanh did not erase those concerns. Mines, mud, maintenance burdens, and terrain constraints were all real in Vietnam. What Khe Sanh demonstrated was something more useful than a slogan. Heavy armor did not need ideal maneuver terrain to matter decisively. At a besieged combat base, the question was not whether an M48 could conduct a textbook armored breakthrough across open country. The question was whether it could survive, reposition under fire, and deliver immediate, protected direct fire when infantry positions were threatened. The Marine historical record makes clear that the defenders had exactly that capability in the form of 5 M48s and supporting Ontus vehicles, held as a mobile reserve and rapidly concentrated at threatened points. That is the doctrinal contrast your title captures. Washington's earlier skepticism tended to evaluate tanks against a narrow image of Vietnam. Dense jungle ambushes and elusive guerrilla bands. Khe Sanh forced a wider view. The war also included fortified positions, large unit North Vietnamese attacks, artillery duels, contested approaches, and moments when the side that could bring accurate direct fire fastest gained a survival advantage. In that environment, the M48 was not a mismatch. It was a force multiplier. And this is where the story becomes more than a battlefield anecdote. Once armor proves useful under siege, the debate shifts from should tanks be there at all to which units knew how to integrate them properly and why. At Khe Sanh, the answer was not technology alone. It was the way Marines combined tanks, Ontus artillery, infantry positions, and air support into one defensive system under constant pressure. And that system is what we need to examine next if we want to understand how the Patton changed minds in practice, not just in theory. Inside the Khe Sanh perimeter, the M48 Patton mattered because it was used as part of a defensive system, not as a standalone symbol of armored doctrine. That distinction is essential. The siege is often remembered for artillery barrages, airlift, and air power, and those were indeed central. But Marine records also show the defenders had a small armored component integrated into the base defense. 5 M48 tanks and supporting Ontus vehicles, positioned as a mobile reserve that could be shifted to threatened sectors as attacks developed. In other words, armor at Khe Sanh was not waiting for an open-field tank battle. It was being used to reinforce a fortified position under pressure, where seconds mattered and protected firepower could stabilize a line before an infantry breach widened. This is where the M48's battlefield value in Vietnam becomes clearer than the old jungle versus tank argument. At Khe Sanh, the problem was not maneuver elegance. The problem was survivability under bombardment, rapid response to local attacks, and the ability to deliver heavy direct fire in poor visibility and broken ground. A tank crew inside armor with a stabilized gun platform and high-volume direct fire capability could support Marines in trenches and bunkers in ways trucks, jeeps, or foot-mobile weapons teams could not. The same logic applied to the Ontus, which Marines employed for powerful direct fire support despite its original anti-tank label. The combination created a layered response. Infantry to hold, artillery and air to disrupt deeper formations, and armored vehicles to smash immediate threats near the wire. Khe Sanh also sat in a wider tactical environment where armor was not theoretical. In early February 1968, the North Vietnamese used PT-76 tanks in the attack on Lang Vây, west of Khe Sanh, underscoring that conventional capabilities were present in this theater and that anti-armor and armored response planning were not academic concerns. That context further weakens the idea that heavy vehicles were automatically irrelevant in Vietnam. The battlefield around Khe Sanh was not a policy memo. It was a mixed-threat environment where artillery, infantry assaults, fortified positions, and armored vehicles all intersected. And that is why Khe Sanh changed minds more effectively than abstract doctrinal debates. It showed that when commanders integrated armor correctly, the M48 Patton did not distort the fight. It increased the defense's resilience. The next step in the story is to examine how this practical success collided with Washington's earlier assumptions and how the broader Vietnam record of armored operations gradually forced a reassessment far beyond one besieged base. The reassessment did not happen because one siege produced a dramatic headline. It happened because Khe Sanh fit a larger pattern that U.S. forces were already documenting across Vietnam. Armored and mechanized units were repeatedly finding ways to generate combat power in terrain that many pre-war assumptions had treated as prohibitive. The U.S. Army's own Vietnam study on mounted combat later stated plainly that early judgments about armor's limited usefulness in Vietnam had to be revised by operational experience, because armored forces proved adaptable and valuable in a wide range of missions. That broader record is what makes Khe Sanh such a powerful anchor for your title. Washington's skepticism was not irrational. It was built on real concerns about jungle canopy, weak bridges, mines, mud, and logistics, but it often treated Vietnam as one kind of battlefield. The war kept producing another reality. Convoy security along contested routes, base defense under heavy attack, rapid reaction to penetrations, mobile fire support, and operations in mixed terrain where roads, clearings, ridgelines, and fortified positions mattered as much as jungle density. In those environments, the M48 Patton's value came from protection, shock effect, and direct fire integration, not from reenacting a European armored breakthrough. Khe Sanh crystallized that lesson under extreme pressure. Marine official histories describe a defense system built from overlapping capabilities. Infantry in positions, artillery, air support, and a small armored reserve of M48s and Ontus that could reinforce threatened sectors with immediate firepower. The point was not that tanks solved every problem at Khe Sanh. The point was that when the perimeter was under bombardment and assault pressure, armor increased the defenders' response options at exactly the moment doctrinal skeptics had assumed tanks would be least useful. Once that reality is accepted, the title's phrase, "proved Washington wrong," becomes more precise. The M48 did not prove that every inch of Vietnam favored tanks. It proved that policy-level assumptions had undervalued how armor could be adapted to Vietnam's toughest fights, especially when commanders integrated tanks into a combined arms system instead of treating them as isolated heavy weapons. Khe Sanh was one of the clearest demonstrations because the stakes were obvious, the pressure was constant, and the margin for defensive failure was narrow. And from there, the argument moves naturally to the battlefield mechanics themselves, what the Patton actually gave Marine crews and supported infantry under Vietnamese conditions that lighter or unarmored platforms simply could not. What the Patton gave U.S. forces in Vietnam's hardest fights was not elegance. It was protected, immediate violence on demand. That distinction is why the M48 mattered at Khe Sanh and why earlier policy assumptions began to fail when tested against real combat. In theory, a tank in Vietnam could be dismissed as too heavy, too maintenance-intensive, and too constrained by terrain. In practice, when a perimeter was under bombardment and local assaults threatened to break through, the M48 offered something infantry alone could not sustain indefinitely: armored survivability for the crew, rapid direct fire, and shock effect at the point of contact. Marine accounts of combat around Khe Sanh repeatedly placed tanks in direct support roles on the perimeter, where their firepower was integrated with artillery and infantry defenses rather than used in isolation. That practical advantage is easy to underestimate if armor is judged only by movement speed through jungle. The real comparison at Khe Sanh was not tank versus ideal terrain. It was tank versus no tank in a siege environment. A Marine in a trench line under heavy fire benefited from having an armored vehicle that could absorb punishment, shift to a threatened sector, and deliver accurate direct fire within moments. Even when visibility was poor and the battlefield was cratered, a tank's presence changed the immediate geometry of defense. It added a protected firing platform that could remain in action when lighter vehicles or exposed gun teams were far more vulnerable. The same combined arms logic appears in wider Army studies of mounted combat in Vietnam, which conclude that armored forces repeatedly proved useful when adapted to mission and terrain rather than employed by rigid pre-war models. There was also a psychological effect that doctrine tables rarely capture. Armor reassures friendly troops and unsettles attacking forces, especially in close fighting around fixed positions. In Vietnam, where many engagements were chaotic and visibility limited, confidence and reaction speed were combat multipliers. A tank crew with protected mobility and heavy direct fire could buy time, restore local initiative, and prevent a temporary penetration from becoming a collapse. That is not a glamorous doctrinal slogan. It is battlefield arithmetic. Khe Sanh made that arithmetic visible under extreme pressure, which is why the M48's reputation in Vietnam cannot be reduced to jungle stereotypes or procurement arguments in Washington. And once the battlefield case is established, the final step is to pull the camera back. The real significance of the Patton at Khe Sanh was not simply that it performed well in one siege. It was that it exposed a larger Cold War lesson about modern warfare. Doctrine fails when it confuses a weapon's limitations with the limits of the commanders who learn to use it well. The final lesson of Khe Sanh is not that Washington was foolish and the field was wise. It is that policy assumptions were too narrow for the kind of war Vietnam actually became. The M48 Patton did not invalidate every concern about terrain, logistics, or vulnerability. What it did was prove that when commanders understood the mission and integrated armor into a combined arms system, heavy tracked firepower could become decisive in exactly the kinds of high-pressure battles where many planners had assumed it would be least useful. That conclusion is consistent with both Marine Corps histories of the 1968 fighting and the Army's broader post-war study of mounted combat in Vietnam, which documented how armored forces adapted to diverse terrain and missions far beyond pre-war expectations. At Khe Sanh, the Patton's contribution was not a dramatic armored breakthrough across open country. It was something more practical and, in a siege, more important: protected direct fire, local mobility inside a threatened perimeter, and the ability to reinforce Marines under sustained bombardment and assault pressure. In that sense, the M48 did more than help hold a base. It exposed a larger Cold War truth. Modern combat is rarely won by the weapon that looks best on paper in one imagined battlefield. It is won by the force that can adapt systems, crews, and doctrine to the battlefield that actually appears. That is why Khe Sanh still matters in the history of armored warfare. It was one of the moments when combat stripped away theory and forced a harder verdict. Washington's early assumptions about tanks in Vietnam were not completely baseless, but they were incomplete. The M48 Patton proved that incomplete assumptions can fail under fire. If you want more Cold War techno-thriller breakdowns grounded in real military history, subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next analysis.